The last few weeks have been very interesting ones for us who have been working with Sandy Matheson, Alasdair Matheson here, sitting hearing about his life from his point of view. He has been involved in many activities, many community bodies. He's had countless honours bestowed upon him. I am not so sure that he counts this Inquisition as an honour, but I am very pleased to have been given the privilege of being allowed to do it. And I thank you, Sandy, for allowing me to come into your house like this and talk to you and get you to talk to me about some of the things that have happened during your own lifetime. Today, we've covered quite a lot of them, I know, but I know at this time that you have been moved by the King's situation in relation to his own illness, because it was an illness that visited yourself, and the result and the end result was actually well, good from your own point of view, but also in terms of the community, the start of a movement that has been very successful in the islands, the Men's Cancer Support Group.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, my cancer discovery was fortuitous because I was in 1991, I was diagnosed with class 2 diabetes, in other words, non-insulin diabetes. And I, on reflection, realised that was a lifestyle choice. I was taking far too much lemonade in my brandy. But having been diagnosed with diabetes, I was subjected to regular monthly tests of my blood to see how I was responding to the tablets. And on one occasion in 2003, the doctor came to me in something of a urgent mode to tell me that there was something discovered in my diabetes test that didn't look good. I discovered later on it was a thing called my blood cells were showing a shift to the left. In other words, on the scale of blood sugar tests, they were seeing a new thing, an anomaly. And before I knew where I was sent off to Rigmore to have a rather painful experience, because I had to have a needle inserted into the bone at the base of my spine to see what the bone marrow picture was. And that showed that I had what I now call chronic myeloid leukemia. Naturally quite a shock to me, and it knocked me down for quite a while, and I had one or two very interesting experiences out of that. My first unhappy experience was that I was, having had the bone marrow test, I was told to stand by the following week when the results would be in. So naturally I began to look out some details, and I came across a place called Cancer Backup in London, and they put out leaflets and so forth. So I armed myself with knowledge about how best to face up to this new problem. And I remember it was, funnily enough, the day one of my grandchildren, dear Abigail, was born. I was out of the hospital, having greeted the little mite into the world, and was coming down the stairs, and the doctor came up the stairs, and as he was passing, he said to me, "Has Dr. Lush been in touch with you?" Dr. Lush being the leukemia specialist at Rigmore, And I said, no. And he said, well, you better go home because he's been on the phone wanting to speak to you quite urgently. So I went home and spoke to him, and he confirmed that I had leukemia. And then I went into Operation Save Sandy mode, and I contacted the telephone number in London to ask them to send me various specialist booklets. And would you believe it, when the voice at the end of the phone spoke, I could have wept. It was a Stornoway accent. A lady with a Stornoway accent. And my immediate reaction, oh my goodness, you're from Stornoway, aren't you? And the voice said, oh, I'm not allowed to say who I am. But I knew it was a Stornoway voice. Anyway, that was the first sign that things were going to get better.
Do you know now who it was?
Yes, but I'm not allowed to say. She was a local girl who had obviously got, I think cancer backup was part of the Macmillan nursing world. And it took me a couple of years really to get my bearings again. And one day I saw in the Gazette an advert from the ladies of the Lewis and Harris Ladies Breast Cancer Support Group, advertising at a meeting at which there was going to be some speaker about cancer, and it had the famous words at the bottom of the advert, all welcome. So I said, right, I'm going to go out there and listen to what this speaker has to say. So I went out to the breast cancer offices, which were at that time at the bottom of Kenneth Street on Cromwell Street, and I was given a great welcome by the ladies, and I was delighted to see two other men. And I well remember, I think after that meeting, the two men and I went for a walk during the coffee break along the Cromwell Street quay. And somehow, out of the three of us talking together and chatting, we came up with the notion, if it's good enough to have a group for ladies, let's have one for men. So we went back into the meeting with the ladies and said, what about a group for men suffering from cancer? And they said, oh, what a lovely idea. And I've taken a piece of the background to establishing a group of proposed activities. The idea for a support group for men in the Western Isles affected by cancer was conceived in early 2007. A cancer-focused group set up by Macmillan lead cancer nurse, that is as close to the invitation, to the identification of my telephone caller, to comment on a professional development framework being produced by NHS Education in Scotland, developed into a general discussion made up of people affected by cancer. Among the participants were a number of men, all of whom had recently undergone treatment. During the focus group, a gap in provision of support for men affected by cancer was identified, and a talk on the subject was given on a cancer open day in Stornoway in June 2007. Now from that, we, with the assistance, and I'm forever grateful to Mary Macleod and her colleagues in the cancer focus in the Hebridean Ladies Breast Cancer Group, for all the assistance, the encouragement, and the practical help. They deputed one of their own ladies, Mary Bergerhout, who came from Golson, to act as our interim secretary and organizer. And some months later, I put a an advert in the Gazette saying what we proposed to do. And we were amazed at the response from men throughout Lewis about joining such a group. So we set up a meeting under a steering group made up of men with a variety of cancer experiences. For example, 2 at that time were actively undergoing treatment. I was one of them. 2 were in remission. 1 recently had surgery, and the other one was nursing a wife who was terminally ill. So we met up and we decided on the following remit. The group's remit will be to offer men who have or have had or been affected by cancer, supporting in dealing with their experience of cancer in a relaxed and friendly environment. Specifically, the group will meet monthly and members will have the opportunity to unburden themselves, share experiences and discuss areas of concern. Links will be established with both the local Macmillan nursing team and with cancer organisations such as Macmillan and Cancer Backup, with a view to accessing the expertise they offer and inviting representatives to group meetings, open days and so forth. So against that background and with that remit, we held our first meeting, I think in June 2003. So we weren't wasting time between the idea and the formation of
2003?
2007. Thank you.
I'm listening.
This is not the first time I've been corrected today. And we agreed that we would meet monthly to do the activities I've mentioned. We would have to start raising funds, and in the meantime, everybody would pay an annual fee of £1. We were conscious of the need for people who couldn't have much money. So we set up the group, and I have the names of the people who within a few months had joined up. And the 2 gentlemen who had joined with me to start going were both affected by cancer. One was William Mackenzie, who came from 17 Tongue. He had been technical subject instructor in the Nicholson and in other schools. He had cancer related to asbestos, but he was not put down by it, and he was a source of tremendous encouragement. And the second gentleman, also from Tongue, was Norman McFarlane of Heathercliff.
Oh, yes, yes.
I'm sure you would
Yes,
know
yes,
Norman. Yes. So the 3 of us got the group to come and join us, and we had about 30 people at the first meeting. And at the first meeting, the call went out for who is going to be the secretary. And you know, at these meetings, normally everybody begins to shuffle and hide and nobody. But one gentleman immediately stood forward and said, well, I have a friend who is terminally ill with cancer, and I would like to make some sort of contribution to his and other people's well-being. I will be your secretary. Roddy John Barts Macleod.
Okay.
And he proved to be the rock on which our anchor landed, and he took us into a whole host of new administrative experiences. And in a sense, although I can say that I was the founding chairman, Roddy John was the rock, as I say, on which the whole ship got stabilised and built. After being chairman for 5 years, my deafness prevented me from running a meeting, and my place was taken by Angus McCormack, who himself was a cancer patient at that time, and Angus has held the organisation together through good days and bad days ever since. The group is going successfully, has raised a huge amount of money because people, once they know that there's a good cause, they just seem to produce money out of the air. So that was what has become of a telephone call to an unknown lady in London.
Who came from Stornoway?
Who came, well, yes, but I'm not going to identify the lady.
Well, however, the group, the Men's Cancer Group, has proved to be a source of great comfort to many people over that time. And I saw a photo even yesterday of the present group giving some, receiving some money, and I was saying, it's our neighbours, it's our friends,
yes,
it's our families.
And it's also got to do with dispelling the fear of cancer. For too long, many people, men perhaps especially, once they got a diagnosis, they tended not to talk about it as if it was a shameful thing. Like mental illness, people went into denial.
It was maybe also not so much, it might have been dispelling the fear, but it also sharing the fear.
Oh yes, which dispels the fear. When you learn that someone who looks quite well has cancer, you begin to say, well, what am I worrying about? Why am I upset when they have it? And then, of course, you only got to live or be friendly, closely friendly with a cancer patient to fall into the other mode of saying, am I relatively lucky? There used to be a phrase that we had when people who got cancer got a diagnosis, they would say, why me? And after a wee while you learned to say, why not me? And I remember quite a few sad occasions. For instance, when Willie Mackenzie passed away, at home I had gone, just at Christmas time, I had gone down to see him, and he actually was on his deathbed. And it was interesting to see how his wife and family coped, because they had been open about it and they had talked amongst themselves. No denial, a resigned acceptance of the inevitable, I thought. So not only did I learn about cancer, I learned the greater lesson about how other people were brave and courageous and put up with these things.
Well, I know who you're talking about, Annie Mary, his wife,
yes,
whose father was a well-known tailor for many years in Tongue.
I was able to recall for Annie Mary on one occasion being taken down to the family home at Tongue to be measured for a kilt by her father, so I knew of the Tongue tailor.
It's interesting, sombre, enlightening, and it has been one of your most recent successes in terms of community activity in the islands. But you've done a lot for other people, but once or twice you did things for yourself too. Rumour has it that you were flying high at one time.
Well, yes, indeed. As I mentioned in earlier programmes, when I was a child, I wanted to join the RAF, but I never achieved that. It didn't get past the sitting room of my family home. But in 1971 or 72, some of us who had an interest in flying were able to meet up with a gentleman called Frank Ogg. Frank was a car dealer who lived in Granton-on-Spey, and because he was like that, he had his own aircraft. Golf, Alpha, Yankee, Fox, Trot. A little two-seater plane with a small engine on it, not much bigger than a lawnmower engine, I don't think. And we took weekly lessons. The plane came across from Inverness Airport over here, and gentleman who was our tutor came across and stayed for 2 days and took us all up and gave us our various lessons and so forth. And in due course, I was able to satisfy him that I could be trusted to fly the plane on my own. Oh, first day I did a solo, it was quite remarkable. Our instructor had been out in the Middle East training people from, I think, Saudi Arabia how to fly. And I think on one or two occasions I detected a certain tetchiness, and I realised that I was putting a poor man in the field of his life worse than ever the students in the Middle East had done. But I well recall on my first experience coming into land, he had obviously put all the fire crew and all the rest of it on alert. This bomb boat is coming into land, be careful, boys. And I came in, landed, and I had been tracked all the way down the runway by a fire engine. And when the fire engine stopped beside me, the guy who was driving it looked at me and he said, "Oh, if I'd known it was you." He didn't finish the sentence. And it was a great experience. I did something like 15, 20 hours solo, not much really. No. But I then, what's my excuse for not carrying it on? I suppose it was pressure of business. But I do recall one day that we came into land on the long runway. We would fly over your own home and down onto the main runway. And the idea was to see how many touch and goes you could do in the length of the runway. You go down, the minute you touched your wheels touched the ground, you pulled up and off you went up, climbed up and you went down again and up. And I had managed 3 touch and goes on the long runway, which wasn't at all bad. I didn't know that my wife was coming to collect me, and as she passed the airport, she saw this aircraft coming down, and I don't know if she knew it was me, but she certainly got a bit of a fright when she saw an aircraft and coming into land like that. And she looked at me and she said, "You enjoyed that, did you?" "Yes," I said, "it was quite good." "Oh, well," she said, "you'll remember, of course, that you have a wife and a family to look after." So, that didn't stop me flying, but it made me stop and think about perhaps that I was a bit selfish.
So that was the end of your flying career. But tell me, how did you pass a medical for flying anyway?
Well, that was where I was going to come to. How did I pass? My first medical was in Inverness by a Ministry of Civil Aviation appointed doctor. It wasn't a particularly strenuous medical. I suppose they tested my eyes and 1 or 2 other things. But that medical gave me a provisional driving license.
For a plane?
I think it was for 4 years. No, it couldn't have been as much as that. It must have been a year, because at the end of my when that expired and I had to go for a new one, it was done locally, and I just took that opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to have a medical. And naturally, that was the end of my flying. I never really regretted not continuing until I saw 3 or 4 of my mates who had started off at the same time as I did, getting their license, and I felt, oh, what a pity that I didn't carry on. The leader of the early flyers was Sandy Matheson. He knew 1 or 2 of the more remote beaches in Scotland. My other and my very close and dear friend Kenny Lemons also got his license. And later on, Ken Macdonald, the lawyer, got his license, and I can't remember who else qualified. I think maybe my friend Colin Scott Mackenzie got his license too. 1 or 2 people locally who must remain nameless didn't so much not get their license as were told fairly early on that they were not going to get the license, because one chap in particular, the minute he got into the plane, he thought he was a Spitfire pilot and was doing things that were very dangerous. I think one of the interesting parts of it was when they simulated a power failure. And the worst time for a power failure when you're flying is when you're taking off, because your tanks are full of fuel. And one day, my George Donaldson, the pilot instructor, said, right, Sandy, one of our aims today is to take you through an emergency engine failure. And he said, what you do is immediately, without thinking about it, you put your nose down. Now you might think, no, you'll pull it up and say, immediately you put your nose down, because that stops your plane from stalling, which is the worst thing that can happen. And okay, well, that's all right, George, you carry on. And the fright I got when he did exactly as he said he was going to do, and I automatically wanted to pull back, and he shouted, no, go forward. And then he showed me a wonderful trick. We were out over the Chicken Rock, about 1.5 miles from the airport, and he turned off the engine. Oh God, it's gone mad or something. And he actually glided the plane in for 2 miles all the way down, and he proved to me and to the other students that a plane, if looked after properly, is inherently stable, provided you keep it going down at a slight angle and getting enough air over the wings to keep it up. I impressed one of my fellow councillors the day that I did my triangular solo flight. I flew down to Benbecula, and I got out of the aircraft at Benbecula all on my own, and sitting in the lounge looking at this aircraft coming into land was Councillor Doogie Morrison.
Oh, yeah.
Doogie knew a few things about the world, and he looked, shook his head, and said, when I came into the airport lounge, Brackle or anything, he looked at me and said, and where's the pilot? And I said, I'm the pilot, Doogie. And he was utterly amazed. So So I got a council friend there in Doogie.
Yes.
Anyway, away from flying high, where are we going to fly to next?
Well, we haven't really said much about your own professional work, because during all this time you were still a chemist.
Yes, oh yes.
So explain how did you manage to work, to carry on working as a chemist and doing all these things?
I don't know. I honestly, looking back, I say, A, how did you do it, multitasking, and B, how did your family react and suffer to it? And I would not, as I said before, I'll say again, I would not have done all that I did if it had not been for my wife and family supporting and encouraging me. I have to confess that an awful lot of it was selfish. Me, myself and me. I'm going to do this, and I had no fixed plan. It all just happened, as it were.
But you know, you achieved high office in many organisations. You are now retired. You have met many people. Maybe we could finish off by talking about some of the people you have met over the years. Those who impressed you, those who left a mark on you.
Well, as a young person, my people who not necessarily impressed me, but influenced me for good. I would start off with John the Chemist, my mentor and friend, and he was a chemist in Roddy Smith's shop, and he looked after me and encouraged me. I remember one occasion he took me aside and he said, "Now you'll come up to my house, and Annie, his wife, will give you a cup of tea whilst I speak to you." And I went, and his lesson was that I was not applying myself properly to my studies. He was quite right, and he said, "You want to get the work, academic work, done now. Otherwise you will not be allowed to study pharmacy in college." And it wasn't in a parental, "I'll clip you around the ears if you don't work hard," or "I'll give you a row if you don't." It was man-to-man talk to give me some objective and aim, and that was John the Chemist. A whole host of other people. You would have seen the Gazette this week with his article about the YMCA. There was a couple of gentlemen there who looked after me. One in particular was Kenneth Stewart of George Stewart's shop. He had been a scoutmaster, and he had met me in 6 months. I was in the Scouts before I deserted them for the Air Training Corps. But Kenneth took me under his wing, encouraged me, and got me, if you want, my first public post. It was as much secretary and then secretary of the YMCA Junior Football League. It was. I went to a meeting where it was another of those meetings. We're looking for volunteers and helpers, and everybody hides under the table, not me. And Kenneth anticipated me hiding under the table, and he said to the assembled group, "Now, there's a young man who perfectly capable of being your match secretary. Sandy, you'll take on the job. Not will you take on the job, Sandy, you'll take on the job." And I did, and I spent 3-4 very happy years being involved in the organisation of that group, as well as being, I shouldn't say organisation, I should say administration, because it had already been set up. That was Kenneth Stewart. There were various other, in many cases, people who have quietly slipped away, who in different ways impressed me and helped me. But I suspect you're looking for people who have some of my colleagues in the town council, certainly Donald Stewart, Mrs. Urquhart, your friend from the day of the Queen's visit. Can't really. I've been more influenced, I think, by events rather than by individuals.
And how individuals deal with events.
Yes, I suppose so.
I take it you include Roddy Smith amongst these.
Oh, absolutely, but he was a relation more than anything else.
Yeah.
But he certainly left his impressive mark on me, and I suppose it's because I heard him talking so much about local government that I became involved myself. Although I can't easily make the link between the two. He certainly talked about local government. He never said to me, Sandy, you'll go in for local government or anything like that. I can't explain. It must have been
a process of osmosis.
Exactly the word I was going to use, a process of osmosis. Because I remember he died in February 1967 at the age of 98. And I stood for the council at the first election after his death in May 1967. Never been able to put that down to anything other than coincidence, because two ladies who, in their own way, impressed me and left me with my mark. They lived in Newton along the road, and at that time Newton was in a terrible state of disrepair. And these ladies, Mrs. Macdonald, a sister of Provost Urquhart, and Mary Bell Langley, Mrs. Dan Slip, who ran a guest house along Newton, came to see me, and they said, now this area is run down and we're not at all happy about it. We are looking for young people like you to do something about it. And what I did about it, I set up what was called the Newton Street Ratepayers Association. And we made representations to the county council and to the town council, and that got me to meet one or two officials of the council, like Alasdair Macleod, who was certainly a good man and a good mentor to me. He took me through the paces and told me what to do, and more importantly, what not to do. So there's another one on my list, Alasdair Macleod, the town clerk. Where do we go from there?
People like D.M. Smith?
Well, that's after I came onto the council. I was appointed.
Don't allow me to put words into your mouth, but from what you've been saying in other interviews.
Funnily enough, I had known more of than known himself personally from the time I was a child, because there was a family connection between his sister Joey, who became Mrs. Stephen, the mother of Kenny Helferleather and the poet, and I knew DM mostly at that time because he was a football hero and a sports hero, and I well remember him dressed in his great big white apron as he served you in Lipton's shop.
Yes. Yeah.
And then in due course I was on the Stornoway Trust, and DM really was someone who made a remarkably good impression on me. And I think in many ways did guide me correctly and encouraged me to get involved in many of the activities of the Stornoway Trust. Then perhaps I'm jumping too quickly if I go into the choir. Well, I met up again with my old classmate Roy Maciver, but perhaps one of the most impressive people I dealt with in the council was the late Douglas Sinclair. Douglas was just first-rate local government administrator. And apart altogether from his work with me in the council, we actually happily became very close friends as well. I'm now looking for other people who... The trouble is, Kenny, there are so many good people who have helped me that I cannot remember them all off the top of my head.
No, and it's probably unfair to be asking you, but you know, there was the council, there were the local organisations, but you, in your various capacities, met many people out with the islands,
Yes,
whose names we probably know, but for most of us are only names. But you actually met a lot of them. Who of these ones were the ones that most impressed you, or maybe even if you want to say didn't impress you?
I can remember the ones who didn't impress me more easily than the ones that did. But let me think. Who impressed me from the outside? The Highland Board people, Andrew Gilchrist, was one of them. He was a very interesting gentleman. He had an interesting war in Japan. He had been out in Malaya at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent invasion. And he was up country out of Singapore one day, and he saw dozens of men cycling past him. And he identified them how? As Japanese. So he got in touch with headquarters to say that he was observing, I don't know, did he use the word an army, but certainly a crowd of cycling soldiers, and he thought they might be Japanese. Headquarters in Singapore, infamously known for their lack of preparation and foresight, said, nonsense, it can't be Japanese soldiers. Anyone who's going to attack Malaya will come through Singapore from the front. The Japanese weren't that daft. They came in the back door. So I was impressed with Sir Andrew, and then the successive chairman of the Highland Board were people that I formed an admiration for, because they were determined to do well for the Highlands, and with a bit of manhandling the islands. Bob Cowan and his man, Ian McCaskill, another very, very impressive gentleman. Bob Cowan, he had a way with him of getting, he had been a banker, he had a way of getting things into perspective, and I admired him very much. Now there was another chairman whom I should recall.
The Admiral Naismith, Dunbar Naismith, was it?
No, I didn't really know Dunbar Naismith. I had a very good meal in his family home. It was a restaurant by that time. It was no longer his family home. So no, I wasn't invited to supper with him.
Because of the offices you held, you met some of the highest politicians we had in Scotland and in the UK. Who of them, or did any of them ever impress you?
Certainly left their mark on me. One of the first to do so was Willie Ross,
yes,
Secretary of State for Scotland. I first met him when he came up here, as did Scottish ministers every year. Willie Ross came up, and I was just a wee boy really in terms of local government, and quite willing to be subservient to this great man. And his opening words to me were quite quite discomforting. Well, Provost, "How's your cloak today?" says he. It was at the time that the clocks were going into, there was a proposal in Scotland to have double summer
yeah.
time, and we had shot it down in flames because it meant that things were all still dark at certain times of the year. And Willie had obviously mugged up his people he was going to see, and that's why his opening words were, "Well, Provost, how's your cloak today?"
He was quite a gruff man, wasn't he?
He was a very gruff man. It was once explained, he had been an army man at one time, I think a wartime army man, and that him left with him with a peremptory sort of attitude to those he looked at as being lower down the ranks than he was. But he was still a pleasant enough chap. George Younger, one of the people who, funnily enough, impressed me in a pleasant sort of way was Willie Whitelaw.
Oh, yes.
Willie was Mrs. Thatcher's Willie, and he and I lunched, no, we had breakfast together at Euston Station. Can't remember why. I must have come off a night train or something, or he was going. Anyway, I distinctly remember that a large part of the conversation was that he was on his way home to Cumberland, which was his parliamentary seat, and that he was a bit afraid of his mother. She came from the Elgin area, I think, and he was going home, and the conversation revolved around going home to one's mother. I think it was more that she was a formidable lady.
A targer.
I don't know. I don't know if she was a targer or if she was a pusher or something, but she certainly exercised his attitude that day. And I form an opinion of a very nice man. Far too good to be a parliamentarian. Another chap that I had an interesting time with was John Smith.
Oh, yes.
Who died betimes. He gave me lunch in the lowest degree of eating houses in the House of Commons. Who else? Willie Hamilton.
Oh, yes.
The communist MP for Fife, East Fife, was another man. He too was a bit of a targer. One who didn't impress me, I shan't give his name, MP for Ayrshire, and his opening remarks were, "I'm sick fed up of you Hielanders coming down here with your begging bowls." He belonged to a well-known Labour Party dynasty in local government in Ayrshire. I met Tony Blair once in Downing Street. Lord Lieutenants were invited to a reception, and he was a bit big on it, I would say. Perhaps for reason, but we didn't
gel.
Who else?
Did you meet John Prescott when he was up here?
No.
Okay.
And if I did, I stood well back in case his fist got me.
Through your lieutenancy, you must have met a lot of the royal family, in as much as you are able to comment. You know,
Well,
who of them who impressed you?
I met all of the royal family at one time or another. Perhaps one of the most interesting one was the Princess Royal. That might have been because she was often here and knew the place. Met Prince Andrew fleetingly, but I think his mind was on other things, golf I refer to, because he came up and he stepped off the plane and he went straight to the golf course. I'm trying to remember the name of the Secretary of State. There was Malcolm Rivkin, and there was...
Alick Buchannan-Smith.
Oh, Alick Buchanan-Smith. How could I have forgot Alick? He was one of the most charming and nice people I met. I knew of him because he had been in Aberdeen University. Not that I knew him, but I knew more about his brother, who was also in Aberdeen University. But Alick Buchanan-Smith, he used to come up to Harris for his holidays. But my outstanding memory of Alick Buchanan-Smith was at an exhibition in Aberdeen, and my group were being pushed aside by a policeman, and I wasn't going to be pushed aside by anyone. So I bridled, and just before the policeman and I had words, Alick Buchanan-Smith appeared, I don't know where from, and said, "Hello, Sandy, how nice to see you. Come with me and I'll introduce you to Mrs. Thatcher." So he did. And
what did the policeman say?
the policeman just had the good sense to stand back.
And did you meet Mrs. Thatcher?
Sorry?
Did you meet Mrs. Thatcher?
He took me to Mrs. Thatcher and said, "Now, Prime Minister, this is Sandy Matheson from Stornoway, a good man," he said.
Sure.
I don't know whether Mrs. Thatcher believed him or not, but she was surprisingly, why do I say surprisingly, she was very pleasant and nice, and as distinct from many of them, she actually did not think Stornoway was an Orkney.
Well, probably the reason for that was because I remember the late Chrissie Stewart telling me that she actually quite liked her as a person.
Yes.
Mrs. Thatcher.
I'm not surprised.
She said she would never forget, if she knew something about you, she would never forget, and she would ask you a personal question.
That's a good summary of Mrs. Thatcher. But speaking of Mrs. Stewart, she was another lady who I had a great deal of admiration for. Not only did she support Donald, but she supported half of Louis when they came down to London. And she was a very, very kind and nice lady.
And she actually was quite important in her own way, in that she helped introduce women's rights within the House of Commons, not in the chamber, but out with the chamber.
That's right. She was the one who got the Westminster Ladies Group going. And I thought it was actually not only typical of her kindness and foresight, but also of her wisdom, because she was able to help make friends across the party barriers, and that must have helped Donald in his career in Westminster. And of course, Donald himself was one of my mentors in the town council. It's interesting, just a final one, talking about parliamentarians. I always found, well, let's put it like this, the majority of good, easygoing people were not conservatives. They were in the Labour Party or the Liberal Party, like Charles Kennedy and various other people. They seemed able to relate better to me. I remember Gordon Campbell, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland. He was pleasant but aloof, and there was no element of warmth. And that was what I would say about quite a few of the Conservative ministers that I met. Another exception to that was Lady Twidsmuir, the daughter-in-law of John Buchan, the famous 39 Steps author. And she was a very pleasant lady. Maybe I'm trying to see that all of the ladies from Westminster that I met were nice, pleasant ladies, but then they were dealing with me. What would you expect?
On that note, I think we've had better stop, in case we get answers that you don't want. But Sandy, thank you very much indeed for allowing me to come into your home like this. I really do appreciate it.
Not at all.
And it has been most interesting, and I am sure people who watch this will find it most interesting. And I think it's important that we get people like yourself to talk about yourself, because we've always talked about you and what you did, but to get your own views again. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for being so tolerant and patient with me.